Picture this. It's a winter evening in 1889. Snow falls softly on the Buckinghamshire countryside, dusting the bare trees that line the long gravel drive. At the top of a hill that shouldn't exist, that was literally built, stone by stone, earth by earth, to create this exact view, a château rises against the darkening sky. Waddesdon Manor, 300 rooms, French Renaissance towers, golden light spilling from tall windows onto manicured lawns that stretch into manufactured woodland. Inside, in rooms lined with Sèvres porcelain and Savonnerie carpets, the Prince of Wales is laughing. Around him, Britain's most powerful aristocrats sip wine from crystal that cost more than their coachmen earn in a year. Servants you'll never see, more than 100 of them, move through hidden corridors, up back staircases, through tunnels that keep them invisible. They carry silver trays. They stoke fires. They exist in a parallel world, one floor below, one door away, always present, never acknowledged. The man who built all this stands slightly apart from his guests. Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, collector, aesthete, one of the richest men in Britain. He's worked 15 years for this moment, for the prince to stand in his home, for the old families to eat at his table. He spent a fortune that would make modern billionaires weep. He's moved a mountain, literally. But here's what you need to understand. He knows they're still laughing at him. Behind the smiles, behind the weekend invitations they now accept, he knows. The cartoons in the newspapers make that clear enough. The whispers at other parties, the ones he's not invited to. The casual cruelty of a society that will take his money, sleep in his beds, drink his wine, and still consider him foreign, still consider him other. This is a story about what money can and cannot buy. It's about a man who tried to build belonging out of stone and gold and beauty, who thought if he just collected enough, built high enough, hosted brilliantly enough, he could finally be safe, finally be home. It's about a family that survived centuries of persecution by becoming indispensable, by making themselves the bankers to kings and kaisers, and discovered that wealth is not the same as security. That acceptance is always conditional. That even a castle on a hill can't protect you when the world decides you're the enemy. And it's about the 100 invisible people who made the dream possible. The servants who lived in the basement. The laborers who died building the fantasy. The quiet army whose names we'll never know, who carried the weight of someone else's longing for legitimacy. If you're drawn to stories that peel back the glamour of old money and reveal the human cost beneath, the grief, the desperation, the impossible bargains people make with power, then stay with me. Like this video, subscribe. Tell me in the comments, can you ever really buy your way into belonging? Let's find out. To understand Waddesdon, you have to understand where Ferdinand came from. Not just geographically, though he was born in Paris in 1839, raised across the great Rothschild houses of Europe, but emotionally, psychologically. You have to understand what it meant to be a Rothschild in the 19th century. The family had done the impossible. In 3 generations, they'd gone from the Frankfurt ghetto, where Mayor Amschel Rothschild ran a small coin shop, to being the most powerful banking dynasty in the world. 5 sons, 5 cities, London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, Frankfurt. A network that could move money faster than any government, that financed wars and revolutions, that made and broke empires. They were brilliant. They were necessary. And they were hated. Antisemitism wasn't some fringe prejudice in 19th century Europe. It was ambient, structural. It was in the political cartoons that drew Jewish bankers as spiders controlling the world. It was in the laws that restricted where Jews could live, what professions they could hold. It was in the casual contempt of aristocrats who borrowed Rothschild money to save their estates, then refused to let Rothschilds marry their daughters. The family strategy was careful, deliberate. Marry within the family, cousins to cousins, to keep the fortune consolidated and avoid the humiliation of rejection. Become indispensable to power. If you're the one kings call when they need cash, they can't destroy you entirely. Build beautiful things. Patron the arts. Be so cultured, so refined, so generous that eventually, maybe, they'll forget you're Jewish. Ferdinand absorbed all of this. the wealth, the fear, the need to prove constantly that you deserve to exist in spaces that considered you an intruder. And then, in 1865, his world shattered. He married his cousin Evelina. She was 18, intelligent, passionate about social reform, already working to improve housing for London's poor. They were happy, by all accounts, genuinely happy, which was rare in dynastic marriages. And then she got pregnant. Childbirth was dangerous in 1866, even with the best doctors money could buy, even in a mansion in Piccadilly with every advantage wealth could provide. Evelina died. The baby died. Ferdinand was 27 years old. What do you do when you're one of the richest men alive and money couldn't save the only thing that mattered? Ferdinand didn't remarry. He stepped back from banking. His brothers could handle the empire. He traveled, and he began to collect. Not casually, not as a hobby. He collected with the intensity of a man trying to fill a void that couldn't be filled. Renaissance paintings, Limoges enamels, Sèvres porcelain, Savonnerie carpets, furniture that had belonged to Marie Antoinette, books, manuscripts, arms and armor, anything beautiful, anything rare, anything that whispered of permanence in a world that had taught him nothing lasts. His relatives worried. They called his collecting obsessive. They weren't wrong. But Ferdinand had a plan. He would build something that couldn't die. In 1874, Ferdinand bought an estate in Buckinghamshire. Lodge Hill, they called it. Except there was no lodge. Just a hill. A bare, windswept hill covered in scrub and clay, without trees, without charm, without any obvious reason for a man of taste to choose it. But Ferdinand saw something no one else did. He saw height. He saw visibility. He saw a place where you could build something that commanded the landscape, that announced itself from miles away, that couldn't be ignored. And if a hill wasn't quite tall enough, wasn't quite dramatic enough, then you'd make it taller. This is not a metaphor. Ferdinand literally had earth moved, soil piled. The topography of England reshaped to create the exact theatrical backdrop he envisioned. Hundreds of workers. Thousands of tons of earth. They built roads where there were no roads. They dug foundations into hillside that fought them at every turn. And then they began to build the château. Not an English country house. Not a Georgian manor or Tudor revival or any style that would let him blend into the landscape of British aristocracy. No, Ferdinand wanted French. He wanted Renaissance. He wanted the kind of architecture that screamed old money, old culture, old legitimacy, even though his family's fortune was new, even though he'd never lived in France, even though the entire point was to be accepted in England. But that's the contradiction at the heart of Waddesdon, isn't it? It's a French palace in the English countryside, built by an Austrian-British Jew trying to prove he belonged to people who would never fully let him in. It's a statement of confidence that's also a confession of insecurity. The architect was Gabriel Hippolyte de Staël, who designed mansions for other Rothschilds in France. The style was Loire Valley Château, think Chambord, Blois, those fairy tale castles that French kings built during the Renaissance. Steep roofs, ornate dormers, towers, balustrades, stone that glowed honey gold in the sun. For 15 years, Waddesdon consumed Ferdinand's life and his fortune. The construction was an engineering nightmare. Remember, this wasn't a flat site in a city with infrastructure. This was a hilltop in rural Buckinghamshire in the 1870s. Everything had to be hauled up that hill. Stone from Bath, timber from who knows where, marble, glass, the mechanisms for central heating, cutting-edge technology that most English estates didn't have, plumbing that actually worked. They used a steam tramway to drag materials up the slope. A steam tramway in the fields of Buckinghamshire. Locals watched in disbelief as this foreign millionaire literally industrialized their countryside to build his fantasy. And Ferdinand didn't just want a house. He wanted a landscape, an entire world. He had tens of thousands of trees planted. Mature trees, not saplings, because he didn't have time to wait for nature. They used a specially designed cart pulled by teams of Percheron draft horses, massive beasts imported from France, to move fully grown trees into place. It was spectacle. It was absurdity. It was a man with infinite resources refusing to accept any limitation, even time. The locals thought he was mad. The newspapers mocked him. But Ferdinand didn't stop. Inside, he filled Waddesdon with his collection. This is where the years of obsessive acquisition paid off. Room after room of treasures. Paintings by Reynolds, Gainsborough, Rubens. Furniture that had belonged to French queens. Porcelain that was worth more per piece than most people earned in a year. Gobelins tapestries. Clocks. Snuff boxes. Books bound in leather and gilt. Every object was a statement. Every room a carefully curated argument. I have taste. I have culture. I understand beauty and history as well as any duke, any prince. I belong here. But here's what makes Waddesdon different from other Gilded Age monuments to ego. Ferdinand actually did have taste. This wasn't just conspicuous consumption. He was a genuine scholar, a serious collector. The things he bought were museum quality, chosen with knowledge and care. If you visit Waddesdon today, art historians still study his collection. It's legitimate. And yet it was also performance. It was armor. It was a gilded cage he built for himself, trying to protect against a hostility that no amount of beauty could fully neutralize. Now let's talk about the people you were never supposed to see. To run a house like Waddesdon, to make it look effortless. To host weekend parties where royalty and aristocrats were served elaborate meals, given perfectly heated rooms, offered every comfort, required an army. At its peak, Waddesdon employed over 100 servants, housemaids, footmen, cooks, scullery maids, grooms, gardeners, a small village worth of people, all working to maintain the illusion that wealth is graceful, that luxury is easy. They lived in the basement and attic. They used separate staircases, narrow, steep, hidden behind panels and doors that guests would never notice. They woke before dawn and worked until after midnight. They were not allowed to be seen unless they were serving. If a maid encountered a guest in a hallway, she was expected to face the wall until the guest passed. Think about that. In your own workplace, being required to turn your face to the wall so your social superior doesn't have to acknowledge your existence. The servants' quarters were sparse, shared bedrooms, minimal heating, while the guest rooms above had cutting-edge central heating, radiators in every room. The people who made the comfort possible didn't receive it themselves. And the wages? A housemaid at Waddesdon might earn £12 to £20 per year. Compare that to the cost of a single piece of Sèvres porcelain in the drawing room. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds. The labor that kept the house running was valued at a fraction of the cost of the objects that filled it. Ferdinand wasn't unusually cruel by the standards of his time. That's the disturbing part. This was normal. This was how wealthy households functioned. The exploitation was so systemic, so accepted, that it was invisible to the people who benefited from it. Did Ferdinand think about the women scrubbing floors in cold basements while he cataloged his Renaissance enamels? Did he consider the moral weight of spending on art what would have been life-changing money to the people who cooked his food? We don't know. The historical record is mostly silent on his relationship with his staff, which is itself an answer, isn't it? They mattered so little that their experiences weren't worth recording, but their labor made everything possible. The glittering parties, the royal visits, the fantasy of effortless elegance. None of it happens without them. By 1889, Waddesdon was complete, and Ferdinand finally got what he'd been building toward. The Prince of Wales came to visit. Albert Edward, heir to the British throne. The ultimate social prize. If the future king slept in your house, ate at your table, laughed at your jokes, then you'd arrived. You'd been accepted. The prince came. He came repeatedly, actually. He liked Waddesdon. He liked the luxury, the food, the wine, the shooting parties on Ferdinand's manicured grounds. He was happy to enjoy Rothschild hospitality. But let's be clear about what this relationship was. The Prince of Wales was a gambler and a glutton, perpetually in debt, always looking for wealthy friends to fund his lifestyle. The Rothschilds, Ferdinand and his relatives, were useful. They threw spectacular parties. They loaned money. They were amusing. But Ferdinand was never truly one of them. The prince would attend parties at Waddesdon, and then he'd go to parties at other estates where Ferdinand wasn't invited. He'd accept Rothschild money and Rothschild hospitality, and then he'd laugh at anti-Semitic jokes at clubs where Jews weren't allowed to join. The British aristocracy in the late 19th century had a peculiar talent for taking your money while sneering at where you came from. They'd marry American heiresses to save their estates, then mock American vulgarity. They'd borrow from Jewish bankers, then complain about Jewish influence. They'd weekend at Waddesdon, then go home and read newspapers that published viciously anti-Semitic cartoons about the Rothschilds controlling world finance. Ferdinand knew this. He wasn't naive. He read the papers. He saw the cartoons, grotesque caricatures of Jewish bankers with hooked noses, clutching money bags, pulling the strings of governments. He knew that no matter how perfect his taste, how refined his manners, how spectacular his château, there would always be a segment of society that considered him foreign, dangerous, other. And yet he kept performing, kept hosting, kept trying. Why? What drives a man to spend 15 years and a vast fortune building a monument to belonging, knowing that the belonging will always be incomplete? Maybe because partial acceptance is better than none. Maybe because the alternative, withdrawing entirely, feels like surrender. Maybe because when your family has spent generations clawing their way out of ghettos, proving that you deserve respect becomes not just personal ambition, but ancestral obligation. Or maybe, in the end, Ferdinand built Waddesdon not for them, but for himself. A place where he could be surrounded by beauty, by objects that whispered of permanence and meaning. A place where the grief that had shaped him, Evelina's death, the child who never lived, could be housed in something that would outlast his pain. The weekend parties at Waddesdon became legendary. Ferdinand was a meticulous host. The guest lists were carefully curated. Aristocrats, politicians, writers, artists, always with an eye toward mixing just enough intellect with social prestige to make things interesting, without threatening anyone's comfort. The meals were elaborate. Multiple courses, French chefs, wine from the Rothschild vineyards, food presented with artistry that bordered on architecture. Everything timed perfectly, everything elegant. After dinner, guests might tour the collection. Ferdinand loved showing his treasures, explaining their history, the story behind each acquisition. Or they'd play cards. Or they'd sit in the smoking room, the men at least, discussing politics and business, while cigars smoldered and brandy glowed in crystal. The women, always carefully chaperoned, always navigating the complex rules of Victorian propriety, would retreat to the drawing room. They'd admire the porcelain. They'd gossip. They'd perform the elaborate social rituals that maintained class boundaries while pretending to transcend them. And through it all, invisible hands kept everything running. Fires stoked, beds turned down, boots polished, messages delivered. The servants moved through hidden corridors, a parallel world intersecting the visible one only at moments of service. Ferdinand orchestrated all of it. He was, by all accounts, a thoughtful host. Attentive without being overbearing, cultured without being pretentious. His guests generally liked him. Some genuinely respected him. But respect is not the same as equality. Liking someone is not the same as considering them your peer. And the world outside Waddesdon's gates made that very clear. In the 1890s, British newspapers and magazines were filled with images and stories about the Rothschilds. Not all of them were explicitly hostile. The family was too powerful, too useful to attack directly. But the undercurrent was always there. Political cartoons showed Jewish financiers as puppet masters, controlling politicians and monarchs. Novels and plays featured thinly veiled Rothschild characters, often portrayed as vulgar, obsessed with money, lacking in true refinement. Even when the family was praised, it was often in language that emphasized their foreignness, their difference. Ferdinand collected art and entertained princes, But in popular culture, the Rothschilds were a symbol of everything anxious Victorians feared about modern capitalism. Ruthless money, international networks beyond national control, power without traditional legitimacy. It didn't matter that the family had lived in Britain for generations. It didn't matter that they'd funded British war efforts, supported British charities, employed hundreds of British workers. They were still other, still suspect. And then there was the casual, everyday anti-Semitism, the clubs that didn't admit Jews, the social circles that remained closed, the way people would accept your invitation but never quite reciprocate, the subtle hierarchies that money couldn't buy your way through. Ferdinand felt all of this. How could he not? He was sensitive, cultured, intensely aware of social dynamics. The château on the hill was his answer, a fortress of beauty and culture that said, I belong. My taste is impeccable. My home is grander than yours. You cannot dismiss me. But fortresses have a way of reminding you why you needed to build them in the first place. Through the 1890s and into the early 1900s, Ferdinand lived at Waddesdon in a kind of fragile equilibrium. He had his collection. He had his parties. He had the respect of scholars and artists who appreciated what he built. He had the prince's visits, which if not friendship, at least looked like acceptance from a distance. He traveled extensively to Paris, Vienna, across Europe, but always came back to Waddesdon. It was his creation, his monument, in some ways his prison. He never remarried, never had children. The line that should have continued from him and Evelina ended with her death. Instead, he poured everything into objects, into rooms, into a house that would outlive him. Did it bring him peace? We can't know. The historical record shows a man who was gracious, generous, cultured. It doesn't show us his private moments, his loneliness, whether, in the silence after the guests left, he ever wondered if any of it, the building, the collecting, the performing, had been worth it. What we do know is this: he thought he was building permanence, a legacy that would last, a place that would shelter his family's name and accomplishments from the storms of history. He had no idea what was coming. Ferdinand de Rothschild died in 1898, never seeing what his creation would endure. He left Waddesdon to his sister Alice, who continued his vision, maintaining the house, the collection, the performances of cultured elegance. For a while, the world he'd built seemed secure. And then, in 1914, everything shattered. World War I wasn't just a war. It was a collapse of the entire world order that families like the Rothschilds had operated within for a century. The great empires, British, German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, tore each other apart. And the Rothschilds, who'd built their fortune on being international, on having branches in every major capital, suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict that demanded absolute national loyalty. Think about the impossible position. You're a banking family with members in London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt. Your cousins are citizens of countries now trying to kill each other. Where does your loyalty lie? How do you navigate a war that treats internationalism as treason? The British Rothschilds supported Britain. The French Rothschilds supported France. The Austrian Rothschilds. Well, their situation became increasingly precarious as the empire collapsed. The neat system of intermarriage and international cooperation that had protected the family for generations suddenly made them suspect everywhere. And the servants at Waddesdon, the gardeners, the footmen, the men who'd maintained the fantasy of effortless luxury, they went to war. They enlisted or were conscripted. They went to trenches in France and Belgium, and many of them never came back. We don't know all their names. The historical records don't preserve the individual stories of working class, men who died in the mud at the Somme or Passchendaele. But we know that Waddesdon, like every great house in Britain, sent its staff to die for a country that had given them minimal wages and invisible lives in return for their labor. The house itself survived the war, but it was changed. Fewer servants, less grandeur. The easy assumption of permanence that had characterized Ferdinand's era was gone, replaced by a creeping awareness that the old order was dying. Alice died in 1922. Waddesdon passed to her nephew James. and the world kept shifting beneath them. In the 1920s and 1930s, anti-Semitism in Europe stopped being a background hum and became a roar. The Rothschilds had always been a target for conspiracy theories, international bankers, Jewish financiers, the alleged puppet masters of world politics. But after World War I, as economies collapsed and democracies fractured, those conspiracy theories metastasized into something darker and more dangerous. In Germany, the Nazis made the Rothschilds a central symbol of their anti-Semitic mythology. Jewish bankers supposedly profiting from war while good German soldiers died. International conspiracies against the German nation. The propaganda was vicious, relentless, and increasingly mainstream. This wasn't fringe politics. This was a movement gaining power across Europe, rewriting the rules, deciding who belonged and who should be eliminated. The Austrian Rothschilds watched with growing horror as the political situation deteriorated. In 1938, after the Anschluss, Germany's annexation of Austria, the Nazis seized the Rothschild Palace in Vienna. They arrested Baron Louis von Rothschild, held him for a year, and only released him after the family paid an enormous ransom and surrendered their Austrian properties. In France, the Rothschild estates were confiscated after the Nazi invasion in 1940. Artworks looted, houses occupied by German officers, the family scattered, those who could fled to Britain, America, wherever they could find safety. And suddenly, Waddesdon's position shifted. It was no longer just a monument to one man's desire for acceptance. It became a refuge, a symbol of survival. James de Rothschild, who'd inherited Waddesdon, joined the British forces. He served in France, was evacuated at Dunkirk, spent the war years away from the house he loved. And Waddesdon? It served the nation. The British government used it to store treasures from the National Gallery. Paintings by Titian, Rembrandt, Velázquez. Priceless artworks evacuated from London to protect them from the Blitz. They were hidden in Waddesdon's rooms, the same rooms Ferdinand had filled with his own collection, now sheltering the artistic heritage of a nation that had never fully accepted him. There's a painful irony in that. The Rothschilds had spent generations trying to prove they were British, trying to earn acceptance through wealth and culture and service. And in the end, what secured Waddesdon's place in British history was its usefulness in a war against a regime that wanted to exterminate Jews. The house survived the war intact. No bombs fell on rural Buckinghamshire. But the family paid a price. Relatives murdered in concentration camps. Properties across Europe seized, looted, destroyed. The international network that had been their strength for a century torn apart by borders and violence and genocide. When James returned after the war, Waddesdon was still standing, still beautiful. But the world it had been built for was gone. Here's what Ferdinand never understood, couldn't have understood. No amount of money buys permanent safety. You can build a château on a hill. You can fill it with priceless art. You can host princes and charm aristocrats and demonstrate impeccable taste. And none of it protects you when the world decides you're the enemy. The Rothschilds survived as a family, as a financial institution, because they were resourceful, because they had international connections, because they could flee. But they survived as refugees, as targets, as people whose wealth made them visible and therefore vulnerable. Waddesdon stands as a monument to that contradiction. It's beautiful. It's genuinely impressive. The collection is museum quality, the architecture stunning. Ferdinand succeeded in building something that would last. But he couldn't build what he really wanted, belonging, security, a guarantee that wealth equals safety. The same society that accepted his hospitality also tolerated and sometimes encouraged the anti-Semitism that would eventually culminate in genocide. The Prince of Wales, who'd visited Waddesdon, his grandson would reign during the Holocaust. This isn't to say everyone was equally complicit. Many British people risked their lives to oppose fascism, but the structures that allowed casual prejudice, that treated Jews as perpetual outsiders even when they'd been citizens for generations, those structures had consequences. Ferdinand built Waddesdon as proof of worthiness, as an argument that the Rothschilds deserved acceptance. And history answered. Worthiness doesn't matter when bigotry is ascendant. When James de Rothschild returned to Waddesdon after World War II, he faced a question that confronted every owner of a great estate in post-war Britain. What now? The world had changed fundamentally. The servant class that had made houses like Waddesdon possible was disappearing. Young people had other options now. Didn't want to spend their lives below stairs serving the wealthy. Taxation had increased dramatically to pay for the war and the new welfare state. Maintaining a 300-room château on a hilltop was becoming financially unsustainable even for Rothschilds. And perhaps more importantly, the moral clarity of fighting fascism had shifted the national conversation about class and privilege. Britain was building a different kind of society. The NHS expanded education, a social safety net. The old order of aristocrats and servants, of inherited wealth translating directly into power, was being questioned in ways it hadn't been before. James could have sold Waddesdon, broken it up, sold the collection piece by piece to pay death duties, let the house become apartments or a hotel or whatever developers wanted. Many great estates went that route in the post-war years, beautiful houses demolished or carved into pieces because no one could afford to keep them whole. But James made a different choice. In 1957, he bequeathed Waddesdon to the National Trust, ensuring it would be preserved and opened to the public. He didn't do it entirely out of altruism. There were tax advantages, and the family retained some connection through a management foundation. But the effect was radical. Waddesdon would no longer be a private palace. It would become a place where anyone could walk through those rooms Ferdinand had built, see the collection he'd amassed, experience the beauty he'd created. The invisible would become visible. The private would become public. The monument to one man's longing for acceptance would transform into a shared cultural resource. For decades after becoming a National Trust property, Waddesdon was presented much as Ferdinand might have wanted, as a testament to taste and culture, a beautiful collection in a beautiful setting. The tours focused on the art, the architecture, the famous guests who'd visited. The servants barely appeared in the narrative. But beginning in the late 20th century, historians and the National Trust staff began to change that. They started researching the people who'd actually made Waddesdon run, digging through account books, employment records, census data, interviewing descendants of servants who'd worked there, uncovering the parallel world that had existed below stairs. And they began to tell that story to visitors. Now, when you tour Waddesdon, you see both worlds. You walk through the grand rooms, yes, but you also see the servants' quarters, the narrow corridors, the small bedrooms, the bells that summon them to service. You learn their names, where they came from, what they were paid. You see photographs of real people who scrubbed floors and served meals and kept the fantasy running. This isn't about vilifying Ferdinand or the Rothschilds. Specifically, it's about honesty, about acknowledging that every monument to beauty and culture built by the wealthy rests on someone else's labor. That the effortless elegance of the past required immense effort, just effort that was deliberately kept invisible. The current interpretation at Waddesdon doesn't hide from uncomfortable questions. How much did servants earn? How did their lives compare to the luxury they maintained? What happened to them during the wars? The tours grapple with these questions in ways that would have been unthinkable when the house was still private. Waddesdon's modern interpretation also addresses something Ferdinand couldn't: the antisemitism that shaped his entire experience. The museum now includes exhibits about the prejudice the Rothschilds faced, the political cartoons, the conspiracy theories, the social exclusion, the persecution that culminated in the Holocaust. This is delicate work. How do you tell a story about extraordinary privilege? A man who could afford to build a château to collect priceless art, while also acknowledging real suffering and discrimination. How do you hold both truths, that the Rothschilds had immense power and wealth, and that they were also vulnerable to hatred that wealth couldn't protect them from? Waddesdon's current approach is to present complexity, to say, Ferdinand was trying to build belonging in a society that would never fully give it to him. He had resources most people couldn't imagine, but he also experienced prejudice that shaped every choice he made. Both things are true. Both things matter. The house displays anti-Semitic propaganda from the period alongside the beautiful objects Ferdinand collected, forcing visitors to confront the context. You can't just admire the Sèvres porcelain without also understanding the hostility that made Ferdinand feel he needed to prove himself through such acquisitions. This approach has been controversial. Some visitors complain that focusing on anti-Semitism or servants' conditions ruins the beauty, injects politics into what should be a pleasant day out. Others argue the interpretation doesn't go far enough, that the Rothschilds still receive too much sympathy given their wealth. But this, I'd argue, is the value of places like Waddesdon in the 21st century. They become spaces where we can have uncomfortable conversations about class, wealth, belonging, and power, where we can acknowledge both beauty and injustice, both achievement and exploitation, where history stops being simple. Walk through Waddesdon now, and you'll experience layers of contradiction that make it more interesting than any simple celebration of wealth or straightforward condemnation could be. You'll see extraordinary art. Ferdinand's taste was genuine, his collection museum quality. The beauty is real. The cultural value is legitimate. But you'll also learn about the cost, the servants who maintained it, the grief that drove Ferdinand to build it, the anti-Semitism he faced, the family members murdered in the Holocaust, the moral complexity of a monument built by people who were simultaneously privileged and vulnerable. The house hosts events now, weddings, concerts, Christmas markets. Ordinary people celebrate milestones in rooms where Ferdinand once entertained princes. Children run through gardens that were created by a man who'd lost his own child. The layers of meaning pile up, sometimes uncomfortably. And perhaps that's the point. Waddesdon isn't a morality tale with a clear lesson. It's a reminder that human beings are complicated, that you can be both victim and beneficiary of unjust systems. That beauty doesn't erase harm, but harm doesn't negate beauty either. Ferdinand wanted to build something permanent, a legacy, proof of worthiness. He succeeded, but not in the way he imagined. Waddesdon endures, not as proof that the Rothschilds deserved acceptance, but as evidence of what people do when acceptance is withheld. It's a monument to longing, to the impossible things we try to build when we're told we don't belong. And maybe in becoming public, in opening its doors to everyone, in telling the full story, beautiful and ugly, privileged and persecuted, Waddesdon finally achieved a kind of belonging Ferdinand never experienced. Not because it proved the Rothschilds deserved a place in society, but because it became part of shared history, part of how we understand ourselves. There's a reason this story resonates now, in the 21st century, in ways it might not have 30 years ago. We're living through another Gilded Age, another period of extreme wealth concentration, where billionaires build monuments to themselves, rockets to space, superyachts the size of naval vessels, private islands, tech campuses that function as self-contained cities, where the gap between the ultra-wealthy and everyone else yawns wider every year. And we're asking the same questions Ferdinand faced. What does wealth buy? What doesn't it buy? Is there any amount of money that makes you safe? Any level of accomplishment that earns you acceptance? Or are there dynamics, class, race, ethnicity, power, that money can't overcome? Ferdinand built Waddesdon trying to prove he belonged. Today's billionaires build different monuments, but often with similar motivations. Proving they're visionaries, not just rich. Proving they're cultured, not vulgar. Proving they deserve their wealth, that they've earned it, that they're different from the old robber barons. And society responds with the same ambivalence. We're fascinated by them. We consume their stories. We attend their cultural institutions, use their products, work in their companies. But we also resent them. We question whether anyone deserves that much wealth. We point out the workers who make their empires run, the warehouse employees, the gig workers, the people whose labor is essential but invisible, just like the servants at Waddesdon. Ferdinand's story matters now because it's our story. We're still negotiating the relationship between wealth and power, between money and belonging, between individual achievement and collective responsibility. What do you leave behind? Ferdinand spent 15 years and a vast fortune building Waddesdon. He filled it with some of the finest art and decorative objects in Europe. He created a landscape, a whole aesthetic world. He poured his grief and his ambition and his desperate need for acceptance into stone and gold and beauty. And it worked partially. Waddesdon survived him. It survived wars and economic collapse, and the dissolution of the social order he'd built it to join. It's been preserved, opened to the public, visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year. But the legacy isn't what he intended. He wanted Waddesdon to prove the Rothschilds were cultured, refined, worthy of acceptance by British aristocracy. Instead, it became evidence of how that acceptance was always conditional, always purchased, never given freely, always contingent on being useful, never on being equal. He wanted to be remembered as a collector, an aesthete, a patron of the arts. And he is, but he's also remembered as a man shaped by grief and discrimination, trying to build safety out of objects. He wanted the house to be his triumph. Instead, it's a question mark. A beautiful, troubling, complicated question about what we owe each other, about what money can and cannot do, about who gets to belong and on what terms. Is that failure? Or is it actually a more interesting legacy than simple triumph would have? Bin, let's sit with the uncomfortable part for a moment. Ferdinand de Rothschild was, by the standards of his class and time, a decent man. He was cultured. He was charitable. His family donated to hospitals, schools, social programs. He wasn't actively cruel. He paid his servants more or less the going rate, probably treated them with more consideration than many employers did. And yet, he spent the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars on a house and art collection, while people who worked for him lived in basements and earned £12 a year. He could have spent that money differently. He could have used his wealth and influence to challenge the systems that kept working people powerless. He could have been radical, but he wasn't, because being radical would have undermined the entire point of Waddesdon, which was to prove he deserved to join the elite, not to dismantle the structures that made the elite possible. This is the moral trap of extreme wealth. Once you have it, the incentives all point toward preserving the system, not transforming it. Because transformation threatens your position. Your acceptance, however conditional, depends on playing by the rules, not breaking them. Ferdinand wanted to be accepted by people whose acceptance was built on exploitation. So he replicated that exploitation. He built a house that required servants to be invisible, because that's what elite acceptance demanded. And we need to sit with that, not to villainize him. He was a product of his time, shaped by forces larger than himself. But to recognize that being victimized doesn't prevent you from victimizing others. That suffering discrimination doesn't automatically make you committed to justice. That good taste and philanthropy don't erase structural inequality. What does Waddesdon give us now? It gives us beauty. That's real and valuable. The art collection is genuinely important. The architecture is stunning. The gardens are a masterpiece of designed landscape. Millions of people have experienced joy and wonder there. That's not nothing. It gives us a window into history, a way to understand the Gilded Age, the social dynamics of Victorian and Edwardian Britain, the experience of a Jewish family navigating antisemitism at the highest levels of society. That's educational, important. It gives us a case study in preservation and interpretation. Waddesdon is a model for how historic houses can tell complex stories, can grapple with their own uncomfortable truths rather than presenting sanitized versions of the past. That's valuable for museums and historic sites worldwide. But most importantly, I think it gives us a mirror. When you walk through Waddesdon, you're not just seeing Ferdinand's story. You're seeing questions that are still live. How do we build lives that matter? What do we owe to the people whose labor makes our comfort possible? How do we navigate systems that are beautiful and terrible simultaneously? Can we ever really buy belonging, or is it only given freely? What protects us, and what leaves us vulnerable? Ferdinand built Waddesdon thinking he was creating permanence. But the most permanent thing about it is the questions it raises. The way it refuses to let us have simple answers about wealth, power, class, and belonging. On winter evenings, when visitors have left and the lights glow in Waddesdon's windows, you can almost imagine Ferdinand there, walking through his collection, touching the porcelain he'd traveled across Europe to acquire, standing at a window, looking out over the landscape he'd literally reshaped, the trees he'd planted, the world he'd willed into existence. Was he happy? Did it work? Did all the building and collecting and performing give him what he needed? We can't know. The historical record doesn't tell us his private thoughts. We have his choices, the château, the collection, the life he built, but not his inner life. What we do know is this: he tried. In the face of grief and discrimination and a society that would take his money but never fully accept him, he tried to build something beautiful and lasting. Something that said, I was here. I mattered. I made something worth preserving. And in that trying, in that desperate, ambitious, complicated effort, he created something that outlasted him. Not the simple triumph he wanted, not proof of worthiness or belonging, but something perhaps more valuable, a monument that makes us think, that challenges us, that refuses to let history be simple. Waddesdon stands on its hill, beautiful and troubling, a gilded cage built by a man who wanted to be free. And in its survival, in its transformation from private palace to public museum, from monument to privilege to space for difficult conversations, it offers a kind of hope. Not the hope that wealth will save you, not the hope that you can build your way to belonging, but the hope that beautiful things can outlast the pain that created them, that complicated legacies can still teach us, that monuments built for one purpose can, over time, serve another. The castle on the hill endures, not as Ferdinand intended, but perhaps as something better, honest. Let's go back to the fundamental question that drove Ferdinand for his entire adult life. Can you buy belonging? The answer Waddesdon gives us is complex. Yes and no. Partially. Conditionally. Never completely. Ferdinand bought proximity to power. He bought the Prince of Wales's visits, aristocratic guests, a seat at certain tables. He bought the ability to display his wealth and culture in ways that commanded respect, or at least attention. But he couldn't buy the casual, unthinking acceptance that came naturally to people born into the British aristocracy. He couldn't buy freedom from antisemitism. He couldn't buy the security of being considered British without qualification. He couldn't buy unconditional belonging. And here's what makes his story so relevant today. That's still true. Wealth still buys access and influence and proximity to power. But it doesn't buy automatic acceptance. It doesn't erase markers of difference, race, ethnicity, religion, origin, that societies use to determine who's really one of us. Think about contemporary examples. Immigrant tech billionaires who've revolutionized industries and donated billions to charity, but still face casual xenophobia. Wealthy black families who can afford homes in any neighborhood but still experience racism. People with new money who'll never quite be old money, no matter how cultured their tastes. The markers of difference shift. It's not exactly the same dynamics Ferdinand faced, but the underlying pattern repeats. Wealth brings certain doors closer, but it doesn't automatically open all of them. And it definitely doesn't prevent those doors from slamming shut when political winds shift. Ferdinand thought if he just built something grand enough, beautiful enough, cultured enough, he could earn permanent acceptance. The 20th century taught his family that there is no such thing as permanent acceptance for groups that society has decided to mark as other. The Holocaust made that brutally, horrifyingly clear. But there's another lesson here too. The performance of belonging, even when it fails to achieve its goal, can create something real. Waddesdon is genuinely beautiful. The collection is genuinely important. Ferdinand's determination to prove his worth through culture and aesthetics did, in fact, contribute something valuable to the world. The fact that his underlying project, buying acceptance, was impossible, doesn't negate that. We need to spend more time with the servants, because their story is the other half of Waddesdon, the half Ferdinand never wanted visitors to see, but the half that made everything possible. 100 people, at peak, more than that, living in the house, working every day to maintain the fantasy of effortless luxury. And we barely know their names. We know some. Historical research has recovered fragments. Mary and Whitchurch, a housemaid. Frederick Tompkins, a gardener. Men and women who spent years, sometimes entire careers, at Waddesdon, who woke early and worked late and kept the fires burning and the floors clean and the silver polished. What were their lives like? Did they take pride in working at a place as grand as Waddesdon? Or did they resent the inequality, the invisibility, the way their labor was essential but unacknowledged? Did they form friendships below stairs that made the work bearable? Did they have dreams of something else? We don't know. Their voices are mostly absent from the historical record. Because when you're a servant, your job is to enable other people's lives, not to record your own. But we can infer some things. We know the work was hard. We know the hours were long. We know the pay was minimal compared to the wealth that surrounded them. We know they lived in cramped quarters while maintaining vast, elegant rooms for people who barely acknowledged their existence. And we know that when war came, the men went to fight, went from serving at tables to dying in trenches, traded one kind of service, invisible domestic labor, for another kind, military service to a country that valued them as soldiers, but not as full citizens with rights and dignity. Some came back, some didn't. The house kept running, though with fewer staff. The fantasy of effortless luxury continued, though the effort required to maintain it became harder to hide. Their descendants sometimes visit Waddesdon now, walk through the servants' quarters, see the narrow beds and sparse furnishings, and say, "My great-grandmother worked here. My great-great-grandfather was a footman." The house that erased them during their lives has become a place where their existence is finally acknowledged. Is that enough? Does the National Trust's current interpretation make up for a century of invisibility? Can you compensate for historical exploitation through contemporary honesty? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're real tensions that historic houses everywhere are grappling with. How do you tell a complete story? How do you honor both the vision of the people who built these places and the labor of the people who made them possible? How do you avoid reducing servants to a moral point in someone else's story, while also not ignoring the power dynamics that shape their lives? Waddesdon is trying. The interpretation is thoughtful, detailed, willing to sit in discomfort. But the fundamental tension remains. This is still a house that celebrates a wealthy man's vision, with the servant story as a subplot. Because that's how the house was designed. The architecture itself reflects and reinforces the hierarchy. Grand spaces for owners, hidden spaces for workers. You can change the interpretation, but you can't change the building. The inequality is literally built into the walls. Here's the question I think Waddesdon forces us to ask. Can something built through exploitation still be beautiful and valuable? Can we appreciate the art and architecture while acknowledging the human cost? Or does acknowledging the cost taint the beauty? There are different ways to answer this. One response: yes, beauty and exploitation coexist all the time. Most beautiful things in history were built through someone suffering. Ancient temples built by slaves. Cathedrals built by poorly paid laborers. Renaissance art funded by corrupt bankers and warmongering popes. Colonial museums filled with looted treasures. Gilded Age mansions maintained by invisible servants. If we reject everything built through exploitation, we reject most of human cultural achievement. So we have to find a way to hold both truths. This is beautiful. This required suffering. Both are real. Another response: acknowledging the cost doesn't mean we can keep celebrating the beauty uncritically. The point of interpretation, of museums and historic sites telling fuller stories, isn't to ruin your enjoyment. It's to complicate it, to make you think about what beauty costs, who pays, and whether we want to keep building beauty that way. Waddesdon can be genuinely beautiful and still be evidence of systemic inequality. Ferdinand can be a man of genuine taste and still be complicit in exploitation. The collection can be museum quality and still represent wealth that could have been distributed differently. All of these things are true simultaneously. And maybe the value of places like Waddesdon now is precisely that they make us sit with that complexity. They don't let us have simple stories, either rich people bad, or look at this beautiful house. They force us to think about power, labor, beauty, and injustice all at once. That's uncomfortable. It should be uncomfortable. Comfortable stories don't teach us much. The Rothschild family embodies a particular paradox that's worth examining closely. They were among the most powerful people in the world, and they were vulnerable to persecution. Both things were true. And that paradox tells us something important about how power actually works. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Rothschilds had extraordinary influence. They financed governments. They literally funded wars. Britain's effort in the Napoleonic Wars was partly bankrolled by Rothschild money. They had a communications network that was faster than most governments. They had access to kings and kaisers and prime ministers. And none of that protected them when antisemitism turned genocidal. Financial power, it turns out, is conditional. It works when societies agree to respect property rights and contracts and law. When those agreements break down, when a government decides that Jewish property can be seized, Jewish citizens can be murdered, Jewish existence itself is criminal, then financial power evaporates. The Rothschilds who escaped Nazi-controlled Europe did, so not because of their wealth, but despite it, because their wealth made them visible, made them targets. The money that was supposed to provide security instead painted targets on their backs. This is what Ferdinand couldn't have known when he built Waddesdon. He thought he was building fortress. He thought wealth plus culture plus beauty would equal safety. He couldn't anticipate that 40 years after his death, those calculations would prove catastrophically wrong. But here's where the story gets more complex. While some Rothschilds were persecuted and murdered, others survived precisely because they had international connections and resources. The family's global network meant that members fleeing Austria or France had relatives in Britain or America who could help. Their wealth, even when partially seized, provided resources for escape and resettlement that most Jewish families didn't have. So wealth didn't protect them from persecution, but it did give some of them tools for survival that others lacked. The paradox doesn't resolve into a simple lesson. It just exists. Power is both real and fragile. Privilege is both protection and target. And Waddesdon stands as a monument to that paradox, built to prove the Rothschilds deserved acceptance in a society that was fundamentally hostile, survived a war that targeted the family for destruction, transformed into a public museum that tells the story, including the parts Ferdinand wanted to hide. Every time a historic house opens to the public, there's a negotiation about what story it tells, what gets emphasized, what gets minimized, whose perspective matters. For decades, houses like Waddesdon told stories that center the owners, the vision, the taste, the achievement of the wealthy families who built them. Servants might get a brief mention, maybe a quick tour of the kitchens, but they weren't the point. The point was to marvel at beauty and wealth. That's changing. Not universally, not fast enough for some critics, but it's changing. More historic sites are telling fuller stories, including the servants, including the laborers who built these places, including the uncomfortable truths about where the money came from: slavery, colonial exploitation, industrial capitalism that ground up workers. And this change is controversial. Some people hate it. They come to these houses wanting beauty and escapism, wanting to imagine themselves in a more graceful era. They don't want to hear about exploitation and inequality. They complain that everything has to be political now, that museums are ruining the experience with social justice messages. But here's the thing. These places were always political. Wealth is political. Architecture that literally looks down on the landscape from a manufactured hilltop is political. Keeping servants invisible was political. The division of space into grand rooms for owners and cramped quarters for workers was political. What's changed isn't that politics entered the conversation. It's that we're now willing to acknowledge and examine the politics that were always there. And that makes places like Waddesdon more valuable, not less. because they become spaces where we can have conversations about wealth and power and belonging that are absolutely relevant today. When you visit Waddesdon and learn about the servants, you're not just learning history. You're thinking about who does invisible labor today, who makes contemporary luxury possible, who cleans the hotels you stay in, who picks the food you eat, who delivers your packages. The questions Waddesdon raises don't stay in the 19th century. When you learn about the anti-Semitism Ferdinand faced, you're not just learning about Victorian prejudice. You're thinking about how marginalized groups navigate societies that simultaneously need them and resent them. About how wealth doesn't automatically protect you from discrimination. About how hatred can be dormant for generations and then explode with horrifying speed. These aren't abstract historical lessons. They're patterns that repeat. And places like Waddesdon help us see those patterns. Every monument costs something. The question is, who pays? Waddesdon cost money, Ferdinand's money, inherited Rothschild wealth accumulated over generations of banking. It cost labor, the workers who moved earth and stone, who built the house, who maintained it. It cost invisibility, the servants who had to erase themselves to make the fantasy work. It cost emotional energy, Ferdinand's desperate need for acceptance, his attempt to heal grief through acquisition. And what did it buy? It bought beauty. It bought a collection that scholars still study. It bought a landscape that brings joy to visitors. It bought eventually a public resource, a place where people can experience art and history who could never have afforded it otherwise. But it didn't buy what Ferdinand wanted. It didn't buy unconditional acceptance. It didn't buy protection from persecution. It didn't buy healing for his grief. It didn't buy him children or a family to inherit his vision. Was it worth it? That's not a question anyone can answer objectively. The value depends on your perspective. If you're a scholar studying 18th century French decorative arts, Waddesdon is priceless. If you're a descendant of a servant who earned £12 a year, while Ferdinand spent thousands on a single tapestry, your calculation might be different. Both perspectives are valid. The fact that they're incompatible is part of what makes this story important. Ferdinand's core question, how do you buy belonging, hasn't gone away. It's morphed, changed shape to fit contemporary contexts. But it's still here. Today, we don't have Jewish bankers building chateaus to prove they deserve acceptance by British aristocrats. But we have other versions of the same dynamic. We have immigrant entrepreneurs who build successful companies, donate to universities, buy sports teams, trying to secure belonging in countries that increasingly debate whether immigrants can ever truly be full citizens. We have black and brown families who achieve wealth and success, but still face discrimination, still have to code switch, still watch their children have the talk about how to behave around police. We have women in male-dominated industries who have to be twice as good to get half the recognition, who carefully manage their appearance and tone to be taken seriously, who know that their belonging is always conditional on performing perfectly. We have LGBTQ plus people who achieve visibility and legal rights, but still face violence, still have to calculate safety before holding hands in public, still know that acceptance can be reversed. The specific dynamics are different. The underlying pattern is the same. Some people have to work harder to belong, have to prove themselves repeatedly, have to navigate the reality that no amount of achievement, wealth, or assimilation guarantees safety when political winds shift. Ferdinand built Waddesdon because he understood this viscerally. And Waddesdon survives because the question it asks, what does it take to belong? And is it ever enough? Remains urgent. There's a reason Ferdinand poured his life into collecting objects, into accumulating things that would last. Objects don't die. Objects don't betray you. Objects can be cataloged, preserved, passed down. If you can't have children, if your wife and baby died and left you alone, then maybe you can build a different kind of legacy. One made of porcelain and paintings and furniture that once belonged to queens. This is grief transmuted into acquisition. Loss transformed into accumulation. It's not unusual. People have always tried to hold on to permanence through possessions. But the scale Ferdinand operated at was extraordinary. He wasn't just collecting. He was building an entire world designed to outlast him. And it worked in a way. The collection survived. It's still there, still studied, still valued. Visit Waddesdon today, and you can see the exact objects Ferdinand touched, arranged more or less as he arranged them. That's a kind of immortality. But here's what he couldn't control: the meaning of that survival. Ferdinand wanted his collection to be a testament to his taste, his culture, his worthiness. He wanted people to walk through Waddesdon and think, this man deserved to be here. This family earned their place. Instead, we walk through and think about loss. About a man trying to fill a void that couldn't be filled. About beautiful things accumulated by someone who couldn't have the thing he really wanted. Evelina, alive. A child growing up. A family, a future. The objects remain, but their meaning shifted. They became evidence not of triumph, but of yearning. Not of belonging. Achieved, but of belonging attempted. Is that worse than being forgotten? Ferdinand avoided obscurity. Waddesdon ensures he'll be remembered. But he's remembered for his wounds more than his achievements. For what he couldn't have more than what he built. I'm not sure he would have chosen that kind of legacy. But maybe it's more honest. Maybe monuments always end up telling truths their builders didn't intend. Let's be direct about something. Waddesdon is fundamentally a monument to class inequality. You cannot separate the beauty from the system that produced it. The ability to spend 15 years building a château requires a level of wealth that's only possible through extraction, from laborers, from tenants, from financial systems that concentrate capital upward. The ability to employ 100 servants requires a society structured to keep some people powerful and others dependent. Ferdinand didn't create that system. He was born into it. The Rothschild fortune was built over generations, through banking practices that were legal and accepted in their time. By the standards of 19th century capitalism, the family weren't particularly exploitative. They paid their debts, honored contracts, often treated workers better than competitors did. But better than the alternative doesn't mean just. And the fact that Ferdinand personally didn't invent class inequality doesn't mean he wasn't implicated in it. This is where conversations about historic houses get difficult. Because if we're honest about the systems that produced places like Waddesdon, we have to acknowledge that those systems still exist. The details have changed. We don't have armies of servants living in basements anymore. But we absolutely still have societies structured to concentrate wealth upward, to make some people's labor invisible, to value capital over human beings. And many of us are implicated in those systems, just as Ferdinand was. We benefit from supply chains we don't see. We consume products made by people earning poverty wages. We enjoy conveniences made possible by someone else's difficult, undervalued labor. The difference is scale. Most of us aren't building chateaus. But the pattern of benefiting from invisible labor while not thinking too hard about the cost, that's not unique to Gilded Age aristocrats. Waddesdon makes that visible, makes it hard to ignore. And that's uncomfortable. It should be uncomfortable. The Rothschild family still exists, still has significant wealth, though nowhere near the dominant position they held in the 19th century. They're still involved in banking, in wine production. The French branch owns vineyards that produce some of the world's most expensive wines in various business ventures. And they're still targets of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. In the age of the internet, the old myths about Jewish bankers controlling the world have metastasized into countless variations. QAnon conspiracies, claims that the Rothschilds control central banks, start wars, manipulate global politics. The specific accusations change, but the underlying prejudice persists. This is worth noting because it demonstrates that Ferdinand's core fear, that wealth doesn't protect you from hatred, remains relevant. The contemporary Rothschilds can hire security, use lawyers, correct misinformation, but they can't make the conspiracies stop. Because the conspiracies aren't really about them as individuals. They're about deeper anti-Semitic patterns that use Rothschild as shorthand for Jewish power. Waddesdon, in this context, takes on another layer of meaning. It's not just a historic house. It's a family monument that survived a century and a half of anti-Semitism, from Victorian social exclusion to Nazi genocide to contemporary internet conspiracies. The fact that it's now public, that anyone can visit regardless of religion or ethnicity or wealth, feels like a quiet refutation of the hatred the family faced. Ferdinand tried to prove the Rothschilds deserved acceptance through private displays of culture and taste. The national trust arrangement creates a different kind of acceptance, not pleading for inclusion in elite circles, but opening the doors to everyone. It's not the resolution Ferdinand imagined, but maybe it's a better one. In the end, what survives isn't what we expect. Ferdinand wanted to preserve his collection. It survived. But he also wanted to preserve a way of life, the Gilded Age world of country house parties and aristocratic leisure and unchallenged privilege. That didn't survive. That world was destroyed in the trenches of World War I, finished off by World War II and the social transformations that followed. He wanted to be accepted by the British elite on their terms. That never fully happened. But Waddesdon was eventually accepted by the British public on different terms, as cultural heritage, as shared history, as a place worth preserving collectively. He wanted to be remembered as a man of taste and culture. He is, but also as a man shaped by grief, discrimination, and impossible yearning. The memory is more complete, more human than the legacy he tried to construct. And the servants he tried to keep invisible, they're finally becoming visible. Their names are being researched, their lives documented, their labor acknowledged. It's slow and incomplete, but it's happening. The history is being corrected, one story at a time. This isn't the narrative anyone planned. Not Ferdinand, not his heirs, not the National Trust when they first took over the property. But it's the narrative we need, one that acknowledges complexity, that refuses simple answers, that looks honestly at beauty and cost simultaneously. Waddesdon today is a monument that argues with itself. The architecture says, look at my grandeur. The interpretation says, think about who paid for this. The collection says, admire this beauty. The historical context says, understand this pain. It's a conversation, not a statement. A question, not an answer. And maybe that's what the best monuments do. Not provide comfortable certainties, but provoke difficult questions. Not let us escape history, but force us to reckon with it. Stand at the base of Waddesdon's Drive and look up. The château rises against the sky exactly as Ferdinand designed it to, commanding, elegant, impossible to ignore. Trees he planted frame the view. The landscape bends to his vision. From this angle, it's easy to see what he wanted you to see. Achievement, beauty, permanence. But now you know what he couldn't control. You know about Evelina dying while he was powerless to save her. You know about the Prince of Wales accepting his hospitality while tolerating anti-Semitic jokes elsewhere. You know about the 100 servants kept invisible in the basement. You know about relatives murdered in the Holocaust, about the families scattered across enemy lines during world wars, about the fragility of acceptance purchased with wealth. You know the castle is also a fortress, and fortresses admit the thing they're trying to protect against. If there's a lesson in Ferdinand's story, and I'm not sure stories like this have clean lessons, but if there is one, it's this. You cannot buy your way into unconditional belonging. You can buy proximity. You can buy access. You can buy the appearance of acceptance. But actual belonging, the kind where you're valued for who you are, not what you can offer, where your safety doesn't depend on your usefulness, that has to be given freely. And societies that make you purchase belonging, that make you prove yourself constantly, that treat your presence as conditional on your performance, those societies are broken. The failure isn't yours for not proving yourself well enough. The failure is theirs for requiring proof in the first place. Ferdinand shouldn't have needed to build Waddesdon to deserve respect. The Rothschilds shouldn't have needed to be indispensable to kings to be safe from persecution. Jewish families shouldn't have had to be wealthier, more cultured, more accomplished than their Christian neighbors to be treated as equals. The tragedy isn't that Ferdinand's strategy failed. It's that he needed a strategy at all. And that remains true today. Whenever someone has to code switch to be taken seriously. Whenever someone has to be twice as good to get half the recognition. Whenever someone's safety depends on being non-threatening, useful, exceptional. The requirement to constantly prove you deserve basic dignity is the problem, not the failure to prove it successfully enough. Waddesdon is a monument to that requirement, to the exhausting, impossible work of trying to earn what should be freely given. But we still have to grapple with the beauty, because Waddesdon is genuinely beautiful. The collection is genuinely important. The landscape is genuinely moving. And beauty matters. Art matters. The preservation of cultural heritage matters. So what do we do with beauty that was created through systems we find morally troubling? With art collected by people whose wealth depended on exploitation? With monuments that are simultaneously achievement and evidence of injustice? We do what Waddesdon is trying to do now. We look at all of it. We don't erase the beauty or pretend it doesn't exist. We don't refuse to appreciate genuine artistry and vision. But we also don't erase the cost or pretend it doesn't matter. We hold both truths. This is beautiful. This required suffering. Both are real. And we ask, how do we create beauty going forward that doesn't require invisible labor? That doesn't depend on massive inequality? That doesn't extract human cost? How do we build things worth preserving without building them on other people's backs? Those are hard questions. Questions we're still figuring out. But places like Waddesdon make us ask them, which is valuable even when the answers are elusive. I keep coming back to Evelina, to the young woman who died at 18, whose death sent her husband on a decades-long quest to build something that couldn't die. She barely appears in the official histories. A footnote, a tragedy that explains Ferdinand's trajectory, but isn't the story itself. She died before Waddesdon existed. She never saw what her death prompted. And yet she's everywhere in that house. Every room Ferdinand filled with objects is a room he filled because she wasn't there. Every party he hosted was a party she didn't attend. Every beautiful thing he collected was, in some way, a substitute for the life they didn't get to have together. Waddesdon is a monument to her absence. I don't know if that's tragic or beautiful or both. I don't know if Ferdinand found any peace in his collecting, or if the house was just an elaborate way to avoid feeling the loss. I don't know if Evelina, if she could have known what would be built in the wake of her death, would have wanted it. What I do know is this: grief makes people do extraordinary things. Sometimes destructive things. Sometimes creative things. Sometimes both at once. Ferdinand channeled his grief into building, into collecting, into creating something that would last longer than love did. And that impulse to make something permanent in the face of loss is profoundly human. It's why we write memoirs and plant memorial gardens and name buildings after the dead. Waddesdon is, in the end, a gravestone. An elaborate, expensive, 300-room gravestone for a woman and a baby who died in 1866, and for a man's dream of belonging that died slowly across decades. But gravestones serve purpose. They mark loss. They say, this person mattered. This grief was real. And Waddesdon does that, even as it does everything else, celebrates wealth, displays art, grapples with antisemitism, acknowledges servants, serves as museum and historic site and public resource. All of those meanings coexist. The grief and the grandeur, the beauty and the exploitation, the achievement and the loss. Walk through Waddesdon now. Look at the Sèvres porcelain and the Gainsborough paintings and the furniture that belonged to Marie Antoinette. Admire the craftsmanship, the taste, the genuine cultural value of what Ferdinand preserved. Then walk through the servants' quarters. Look at the narrow beds and steep staircases and bells that summon them to service. Think about the 100 people who made the fantasy possible. Read about the anti-Semitism the family faced, the cartoons and conspiracies, the relatives murdered in concentration camps, the way wealth didn't protect them when hatred turned genocidal. And then step outside, stand on the terrace, and look out over the landscape Ferdinand created. Trees he planted, views he designed, a world he willed into existence through determination and grief and impossible wealth. It's all there. all the contradictions, all the meanings. The castle Ferdinand built to prove he belonged is now a public space that belongs to everyone. The private monument became shared heritage. The fortress opened its gates. Did Ferdinand get what he wanted? No, not really. But what survives is more interesting than his original vision. More honest, more useful. Waddesdon endures, not as proof of the Rothschilds' worthiness. We don't need buildings to prove anyone's worth. It endures as evidence of what people do when they're told they don't belong. The beautiful, terrible, complicated things we build when we're trying to survive in societies that won't fully accept us. And that story, that human, messy, unresolved story, is worth preserving, worth telling, worth wrestling with. The château still stands on the hill. The questions it raises are still urgent. The beauty and pain are still tangled together, inseparable. That's the inheritance Waddesdon gives us. Not answers, questions. Not comfort, challenge. Not a simple past, a complicated one that looks uncomfortably like our present. And maybe in looking honestly at what Ferdinand built, at both its grandeur and its cost, both its achievement and its limits, we can think more clearly about what we're building now, what we're willing to pay, what we're asking others to pay, and whether the monuments we're creating will endure not just as beautiful objects, but as honest reckoning with what they cost to build. The castle on the hill remains, asking its questions, waiting for us to answer.